Hello there, my name's James Rogers and I'm one of the IB history teachers at Frankfurt International School. My colleagues and I have decided to create a series of video tutorials to help students, any IB student from around the world, with some of the parts of the program that perhaps more commonly cause confusion and or perhaps a little bit more challenging. We've created this series of video tutorials as experienced IB history teachers. We have approximately 50 to 60 years of combined experience, and many of us at Frankfurt have also been IB examiners. There's two things we should say to start with. Actually, really three things that we would like to remind you of. The first thing is that these videos can be watched in any order. Each of them is a standalone video, as the topic it talks about is really unique to itself and doesn't necessarily have to be prefaced or followed up by any other particular video. The other thing we should say is that this video, as with all the videos, are the sum of our experience and our knowledge from, in my case, teaching IB since 1998. But it is possible that your teacher at your school might see things differently on some or all of what we're about to say. And so we don't intend these videos to be some sort of Bible or, you have to do it this way, otherwise you're going to flunk kind of thing. It's nothing like that. It's simply the sum of our experience, and others might have slightly different advice. The third thing we should say is that nothing in these videos is a substitute for real research and real work. If it's this video particularly on internal assessment, this video is not going to help you circumnavigate the research and the writing. It is simply going to offer you advice on how to go about some of that. If you're at Frankfurt International School, you're almost certainly watching this video or accessing it via our virtual learning environment, Haiku. For anybody else, you've either seen this video on our Frankfurt IB World History website, which can be found at www.ibworldhistory.weebly.com, or from our YouTube channel, which we've saved these videos on YouTube under my company, which is the Expat Teacher Network. So if you just plug in Expat Teacher Network, you'll find us, probably under my own name. So what we're going to start with today is the internal assessment, but specifically we're kind of going back to front because discussions amongst different IB history teachers around the world have made it clear that it's the third part, the reflection part, that is causing students the most confusion and trouble. So that's what we wanted to start with today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Basically, we wanted to start this video with three basic questions. One, why is the IB making me write a reflection? Two, what methods do the historians use? And three, probably the most important part for you, the student, how do I actually go about writing my reflection? So basically, we're dividing this video into two parts. The first part is talking about the philosophy or the reasoning behind why you have to do this, which will help inform the third part, which is what exactly is it that you have to do in that third part called reflection. Okay, so let's start with the why do I have to do this question. Well, the truth is, for any historian and any history student, you can go back as far as the Middle Ages to the year 1200 and something. And there are too many documents on any one historical topic. The amount of paperwork and the amount of documentary evidence or archaeological evidence, if you're into ancient history, that you would have to sift through in order to read everything is far too much for any one person to do in a lifetime. And so what this means is that historians have to choose. We have to separate, essentially, evidence into two categories: the relevant stuff and the not so relevant stuff. And of course, that sifting and that choosing depends on what exactly is it that you're trying to learn about. What exactly is your topic? And for the internal assessment, of course, your topic should be a very, very narrowly focused question. Don't forget, you have a word limit of only 2,000 words. That's not a lot, especially when you consider that middle section, the essay section, is going to chew up a lot of that 2,000 words. It doesn't leave a whole lot for the reflection. Your reflection really, it can't be more than maximum about 300 or 400 words, I think is what the IB recommends. But the key to it all is assigning significance and importance to the evidence that you're confronted with. And this leads us to sort of the ages-old million-dollar question. Well, how exactly is it that historians achieve objectivity? It's no good us producing books on the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, written by Israeli historians, where there's no measure of objectivity, where it simply is one tract of, it's all the Arabs' fault because of the following reasons. Something like that isn't going to have a high degree of credibility. Or, for example, even a book about the origins of the First World War written by somebody who's British that claims it's all the Germans' fault, we have to be at least suspicious of that, because we have to at least consider that their nationality might be interfering with their objectivity. Maybe not, but on the other hand, maybe yes. So, in answer to the question, why do I have to do this? The IB wants you to demonstrate an ability with this historical method. Can you research the way real historians do? Because if you can't, then you're probably not deserving of a top grade in IB history, and quite frankly, the chances that you'll be successful with studying history at the university or college level are, well, not very high, comparatively speaking. On the other hand, if you can demonstrate an ability in this is very impressive, and this is exactly the kind of student that's deserving of a 6 or a 7 in IB history, and it's also the kind of student that's going to do incredibly well if they choose to study history at the post-secondary level. So let's talk about this historical method. A lot of you have probably heard of the scientific method that's used by any physicist, biologist, or chemist when they go to do research and do experiments and reach conclusions in science. And part of the reason that scientific conclusions are considered to be so certain is that they're all using exactly the same method. And of course, this is supposed to provide a standard method of creating conclusions and creating, therefore, theories that are based on conclusions, right? And the idea is that this enhances certainty. Because we've all used the same method, there's that constant there. It means that the conclusions we've all reached have at least a certain minimum level of certainty. And this is the same idea behind history, and therefore we call it the historical method. However, it's a little bit slipperier than the scientific method. Virtually all scientists in the world agree on the scientific method. They agree on what it is, they agree on how to go about it, and they agree that it's the best way to achieve certainty in the natural sciences. Well, sadly, history is not quite that concrete. There is debate over the existence of the historical method. Some historians and some non-historians claim that it doesn't really exist, that historians simply research in a variety of ways such that there's no one step-by-step method that you can focus on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that historical conclusions are wrong or uncertain, but it does mean that this method is lacking. Most historians would disagree. Most historians would argue that we do have a method. Probably the most famous case is Daniel Goldhagen in his book Hitler's Willing Executioners, where he was confronted with a bulk of evidence, about 80 to 90% of which said that ordinary Germans were not supportive of the mass genocide and the Holocaust, and then about 10 to 20% said it was, specifically when he focused on the German military and its activities in Poland and the Soviet Union. And he chose to build a thesis around the 10 or 20% and ignore the 80 to 90%. Well, this is why he was discredited. His methodology was faulty. That's not the way we work in history. If we're confronted by a body of evidence, the bulk of which points us to conclusion X, we don't then try to build a thesis around conclusion Y. And so that leads me to this. These last 2 bullet points that I have in this particular slide. The historical method is based on the 3 R's, not the reading, writing, arithmetic that you learned in elementary school, but reliability, repetition, and reasoning. So let's have a look at each of these. What exactly do we mean by these key terms, and how can we use them to help build an IA reflection? So reliability. Really simply, was the source real or is it forged? That's where you start with. In 1984, for example, there was a gentleman who offered copies of what he said were diaries of Adolf Hitler to Stern magazine, which is one of the top political and economic social commentary magazines. It's like a Time magazine kind of thing, but here in Germany. And it became clear a few weeks into this, and Stern had even published excerpts of this and written articles about them, and then it came to light through handwriting analysis, etc., that these were in fact forged, that this person had created these documents himself in order to sell them and make a lot of money, but that they in fact had nothing to do with the real diaries of Adolf Hitler. And so that's one example of just a pretty straightforward example of where reliability caused us to achieve the truth, or to achieve a solid answer. The second question we sometimes have to ask ourselves is it archaeological evidence? Is it a piece of pottery or a stone temple or some sort of painting? Or is it a narrative? Is it simply a written document? The reason this plays a role in reliability is written documents are more likely to be forged. They're more likely to simply be somebody's observations and therefore inaccurate. It's highly unlikely, for example, that the ancient citizens of Athens would have gone to the trouble to build a whole temple to the goddess Athena on the Acropolis, what we now know as the Parthenon, if this goddess and this temple didn't have some significance to them. It's very unlikely they would have spent that money, even though they spent the money of the Delian League, not their own money. But it's highly unlikely they would have gone to the trouble to build it if it weren't something significant. Also, the fact that it still exists means that we can prove that it was built. It's still there. The other question we have to ask ourselves with reliability is how close is the source to the event being studied? A good example of this is the so-called Hossbach Memorandum that maybe some of you that do causes of World War II have heard of in your IB history class, right? A memorandum made by a German military officer named Hossbach when he attended a meeting with Adolf Hitler and others where Hitler laid out his plan for World War II. Because he was at the meeting and the memorandum is basically his notes from the meeting and he was an eyewitness, we consider that to be much more reliable than if it were somebody, say, reporting about the meeting from something they heard from some second or third party. If you want to look at it in legal terms, direct evidence is considered more convincing than hearsay evidence, right? In a court of law, in fact, hearsay evidence isn't even admissible. So then we come to repetition. This is really simple. Do multiple independent sources agree? If we have two accounts of the Battle of Gaugamela, one from the Greek side, Alexander the Great, and one from the Darius Persian side, and they both agree on the outcome of the battle, then our reliability, our certainty is greatly enhanced. If it's the Battle of Lexington and Concord, however, where one side said the British shot first, the American side says that, and the British side says the American shot first, then our ability to draw conclusive or reliable conclusions is much more difficult. Fortunately, in that example, it's not really so significant historically who shot first. What's more significant is that the battle took place and the American Revolution actually was started and happened. So the last thing is reasoning. And this is kind of code word for just basic logic. Does the source or conclusion fit with other already proved conclusions, right? Do we have additional evidence that simply adds to what we already know? If we do, then the certainty and reliability is very high. If not, then it's going to cause us to maybe re-examine what we already know, and maybe we need to alter our thinking. The word that's often used for that is revisionist, right? Those of you studying the Cold War, revisionist historians were the ones that said, look, if we look at the American documents as well as the Soviet documents, it seems clear that actually maybe the Soviets aren't completely to blame. Maybe actually it's the United States that's to blame. And then, of course, other theories after that added to that, and we ended up with a post-revisionist thesis that said, nah, both sides really have some fault or blame here. Is it more plausible than what we currently believe? That's probably why the post-revisionist thesis of the Cold War came to be the most accepted one for many years, is that it seemed with time and more emotional distance that it was more likely that both sides shared the blame as opposed to only one side being to blame. And again, part of that is just human nature and human logic. We're much more likely to believe that in a bad argument, both sides bear some of the responsibility rather than it being all one person's fault. And this gets us to our next point. It becomes a better explanation. More situations can be explained by it, or it simply seems to make more sense to us. But the last thing is, too, does it contain a variety of facts? All good conclusions have to be based on facts. We can't forget that. History and historical analysis and historical study is about real things that happen to real people in real times in real places. And every conclusion we reach has to have that as its basis. Students that write mediocre IAs or mediocre exam answers versus students that get top marks, it's because the students with top marks don't just have well-structured arguments, but they have structured arguments that are based on good, solid, detailed examples. Okay, that's something that's really, really important. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. How do you write your reflection for your IA? So the first thing I think that you have to do is you have to put yourself in the role of an historian. After all, this is basically what the IB is asking you to demonstrate. What problems or challenges did you encounter? What was difficult about writing the IA? Was there, for example, maybe too much data? Were you doing a topic about, say, Hitler's economic policies and the extent to which that garnered him support, or the extent to which that prepared Germany well for World War II, and you're simply overwhelmed with data because Hitler and Nazi Germany have been written about by so many different historians. And so you need to talk a little bit about why or how did you overcome this challenge. Maybe there was too little data. Maybe you were doing a topic that hasn't been written about very much at all, and you had to try to balance that out with statistical data or other raw primary sources because the amount of secondary analysis was lacking. That's something else you could mention in an IA. What biases were there? Were you writing about the origins of World War I, and one of the books you used was Fritz Fischer, where he insists that Germany was planning for war and that therefore bore the bulk of the responsibility for the war? And how did you take into account those biases? Did you do additional research with authors that offered the counter thesis or the counterclaim? Did you seek out additional raw data or primary source data to see if these biases really were true? You sort of looked at it from like, well, if this is going to be true, I need to convince myself. And most importantly, and this is going to sound like your theory of knowledge class, and I know, and I think, quite frankly, that's the point. I think that's why the IB has included this, is they want to see that there's a better merging or meshing of theory of knowledge in the subject classes, and the reflection in the IA is part of that. How did you decide which evidence to put into your IA, and how did you decide which to leave out? Don't forget, your works cited list is just that. It's a works cited. If you did not cite or quote from that source, it has no business being on that list. Our personal opinion at Frankfurt is if you want a top grade on your IA, you need a works cited list that's somewhere between 8 to 10 sources. By the time you're hitting 15, 18, 20 sources, that's probably too many. That's more like extended essay, where you've got a 4,000 word limit instead of a 2,000 word limit. So did you encounter different expert opinions? Hopefully yes. If you didn't, then probably something is wrong. And which of these opinions was most convincing? And why was it more convincing? So answering these questions, you have to look at these questions, I would say, kind of like a checklist. When you go to write your IA, basically start by maybe making notes that answer these questions for your particular topic, and then sit down and write your IA, and then go back and look at this list of questions again and say, have I achieved it? Have I answered all of the questions on this list? If you have, then quite frankly, you've probably got a pretty darn good reflection for your IA, one that's going to score 4 points out of 4. So in some sense, it's not horribly difficult or time-consuming, but it is probably the piece of your IA where you have to do the most thinking beforehand, and sometimes that makes it the most difficult. But we really feel like these questions really will lead you to the best IA. So that's basically what we wanted to say about writing a reflection. The third part of the IA, it's worth 4 marks. It can be a tough 4 marks to get, but if you use that checklist, then hopefully you've got a good shot at 4 points out of 4. And of course, we have to hedge our bets a little bit here, because the truth is, as we sit and make this video in June of 2016, the actual truth is that this particular syllabus hasn't been examined yet. So no one has actually been assessed using the current IA criteria. It might be that we're adding another video in a couple of years that has more specific advice. about some of the things we've said, or that maybe even contradicts it, because we've learned that, oh gee, the IBO is going to interpret it, or the moderators are going to interpret it a different way. Anyway, lastly, we'd just like to say thanks for listening, and hopefully what you've seen today has been of help. If you're a student at FIS and you'd like to pass this video on to friends at other schools, please direct them to our website, ibworldhistory.weebly.com, or our YouTube channel, which is the Expat Teacher Network. That's actually my company's YouTube channel, but that's where we're going to store these videos. And as I said, thanks for listening. Look out for our next videos that will deal with everything from exam answers to note making to all kinds of things. Hopefully we'll have a whole series available in the next months for you, and that will help you achieve the grade that you want and deserve in IB history. So until then, thank you, and we'll see you next time.